Kendra Bosworth from ACSL, and I'll be facilitating this session. If you have any questions or need any support, reach out to myself or Karen or Tanya, who are other ACSL staff members, in the chat box. We're going to start with our normal prayer and our acknowledgement of country. So if you don't mind, in the name of the Father and Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Gracious God, provide us with a listening heart so we may see and hear the voice of children and adults at risk. May our organisations, authorities and families listen to, respect and do what is required to keep children and adults at risk safe. We ask you to help each of us to exercise our duties with compassion, integrity and clarity as we work together to enact real change and uphold the safety of all who come in contact with our church and communities. Amen. I recognise that I'm facilitating this from Gundungurra country and the traditional custodians of the lands in which you are all joining from today. If you have a chance, can you put in the chat box what country you're coming from today so that we can recognise all of the different lands and the traditional custodians. We honour the First Nations people's culture and connection to land, sea and community, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. ACSL also acknowledges the lifelong trauma of abuse victims and survivors and their families. The failure of the Catholic Church to protect, believe and respond justly to children and adults at risk and the consequent breaches of community trust. So please be aware that this session does discuss abuse and therefore may contain content that you find confronting. If you start to feel distressed, please use your own judgment and ensure you're safe. You can find support resources on the ACSL website. I am really pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Pooja Sawrikar, today. Really happy that she's here today. She's an independent research consultant specialising in gender and race equity. She has over 20 years of experience as an academic working at the Department of Psychology, University of Sydney, the University of New South Wales and Griffith University. Research area and numerous publications that cover racism, child protection, domestic violence and culturally appropriate delivery and culture, migration, mental illness and social cognition. She's the founder and director of Scholar Freedom, designed to redress inequity in academic publishing. So Pooja, while Pooja's doing the talking for most of today, we really do want to hear from you. So if you can put your questions into the chat box, once she's finished her slides, I will help redirect those questions to Pooja for the amount of time that we have. So saying all that, welcome Pooja, really lovely to have you here. Really nice to know that you're joining us again. And I am going to spotlight you and turn myself off.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Kendra, as always, and it is a pleasure to be here again. Can you all hear me? I'm coming in nice and clear. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we live and work and pay my respects to elders past and present. I am coming to you today from the unceded lands of the Yugambeh and Kombumerri peoples. Today's talk is really heavy, so let's just get into it. But can I please ask that questions are saved till the end? I think my talk goes for about 45 minutes. And repeating what Kendra has said, I trust that you will know if you need to walk away at any point for self-care. Oh, how do you go to the next one? So last time I went through module 2 of the CPD program that I've developed, and today we're going to do module 4 on culturally appropriate service provision for victims, survivors of child sexual abuse from CALD or culturally and linguistically diverse communities. I don't want to get derailed here, but just so you know, I don't like the term CALD, and I'm only using it here for consistency with the program. You can buy me a coffee another day and I'll chew your ear off later about that.
Pooja, can I also interrupt? I'm sorry, and say that the recording of the previous webinar was sent out in the reminder for today's thing so that people can go back and watch that if they need to.
Awesome, thank you. Then it'll have a sense of continuity. Okay, so if a child and their family want to seek out formal services, or an adult survivor is feeling ready to engage with the formal therapeutic setting, that's a good thing. But there could be barriers that are stopping them from doing that, which are important to acknowledge. And I've grouped those barriers into 3 types. There we go. The first is non-cultural barriers, which are experienced by people from all cultural groups. The first is lack of awareness. Generally, we don't know what's around us in our local community unless there's a need for that service. It's a bit like when a woman suddenly gets clucky and notices babies everywhere. And she's like, were you always here? And it's like, yes, you were. You just didn't see them before. So our brains tune out information that is self-irrelevant. So it's exactly the same here. If you don't need something, you don't know it's there. However, this barrier can interact with factors like low English proficiency or shame for seeking support outside of the family. So in this case, lack of awareness of services for CALD communities is not wholly non-cultural. There could be lots of elements going on there, which can make it a bit hard to go, is that a cultural barrier or is that a not cultural barrier? Another barrier that's shared cross-culturally is lack of worthiness and wanting to forget. It could very well be that victims don't see themselves as deserving formal help because they have low self-esteem, or at worst, they have internalized culpability or blame for the crime, which is absolutely not the case. They may also fear being taken back to events they would rather forget. We all know that every time a victim has to tell their story, it's re-triggering. Sorry, planes. The therapeutic process makes them relive their pain and trauma, which are things they might rather avoid. That same emotion might be encouraged by caretakers who are also going, yes, let's not talk about it anymore. Let's move on. Let's forget about it. The third non-cultural barrier is fear of children being removed. Again, this is shared cross-culturally. So families may not seek out your services because they're scared that child protection will be called and their child will be removed. Now, slight segue here about what is cross-culturally similar and different. Fear of children being removed is a non-cultural barrier, but fear of authorities is heightened in CALD communities. So the fear of children being removed is heightened. And it's important that service providers understand where that intense fear of authorities comes from. One reason is that they may have had poor experiences with authority figures in their country of origin, which then shapes their expectations of authority figures post-migration. It could also be that because power is distributed hierarchically in collectivist cultures, with authority figures having high power, it would be a great cultural violation to deviate from that power structure. So it's just understood that you're expected to respond to people with authority with deference, respect, revere, obedience. The third reason is about racism. No matter where you live in the world, people are socialized to learn that white skin has the most social power. As a result, they're going to be extremely fearful of a white service provider with the statutory power to remove their children. It's really important that you tell your CALD client if you're a mandatory reporter, because depending on what happens in their country of origin, they may not even know that that's a thing, that their child can be removed. So you need to let them know what's at possible stake. Having said that, it's not the case that all child protection workers will remove the child if their assessment substantiates sexual abuse. That's not the default response. There's many factors that go into that decision. So it's also important that the service provider lets the family know that it is a risk, but not always a risk. Now moving on to migratory or acculturative barriers. These barriers tend to be mislabeled as cultural barriers, but I want to distinguish them because cultural barriers refer to things that belong to the group, like cultural norms or traditions, beliefs, trends, patterns. This means they occur even before migration. What we're talking about here are barriers to service uptake that occur only after migration. The first is fear of deportation. So CALD victims may not seek out professional help if they see it to endanger a precarious or unconfirmed visa or immigration status. The second is language barriers. So they may have low English proficiency, which is stopping them from accessing formal services. But this is something the organisation can do something about. If it looks like your org is not language friendly because it sees English as the most superior language that everyone else should assimilate to, so it has no presence of language accessibility, translated documents, interpreter provision, bilingual staff, then all of these things have an impact on whether that person who might be considering your service does actually take it up. Finally, cultural barriers refer to things that would occur even before migration. The first is fatalistic or religious beliefs. Some people may not take up formal mental health services because they interpret the abuse as being God's will. This was meant to be, so there's no point addressing it. It could also be that they're already receiving support from spiritual leaders or guides within their community, so there's no need for them to be taking up formal services. Leading on from that point, it's normal within collectivist cultures to rely on extended family when problems arise. In fact, it could be quite bewildering a concept. Sorry, you want me to seek out help from a stranger? Now, that's just strange. Okay, so it could be a real cultural violation. The other thing is that Western psychotherapies require individual examination, insight, self-disclosure, verbal and emotional expressiveness. These characteristics align with individualism but contrast with Eastern values for deference, respect, obedience to the superior. In this context, the superior is the therapist, and that's magnified if they are older or male. So, for example, they may not make eye contact with you. They keep looking at the ground, but it's actually their body language saying, I know that you have the power in this relationship, and this is my way of showing that. Or the therapist might say, based on what you're saying, it sounds like you're saying this. And in your mind, you're like, nope, you are completely off. You have paraphrased that all wrong. But they wouldn't tell you that because that would be going against the superior, the expert, the authority. If they have any disagreements or negative feelings, they will keep that under control because in collectivist cultures, social harmony is far more important to preserve than how do I feel? What's my story? Let me speak my truth. So these are contrasting sociocultural values. The third cultural barrier is shame for seeking outside support. Yes, it's normal for CALD communities to rely on one another, but even that could get toxic. oh, if I tell my aunts or my uncles or my cousins, they might start gossiping, and then that's going to threaten the family name. So you start to lose the protective factor of collectivism, at which point, where are you going to go? One useful space is the formal service sector. But even at that point, one thing that could stop them is, yeah, but what if someone finds out? Now, seeking out formal help is actually a cross-cultural barrier. The difference is that within individualistic cultures, people might fear being seen as weak. It's a stigma or shame for not being self-reliant. But in the collectivist context, that shame extends to everyone in the family because it's a collective. In one study in Australia conducted in 2011, it said, some women report they would rather be killed than have their experiences and contact with the sexual assault service disclosed publicly in the community. So when this is what is at stake, when this is the gravity of the consequence for them seeking out formal services, it's really important that the service provider repeat to them over and over again, it's okay. You can say this stuff here. It's confidential. I'm bound by law. When they're highly stressed and come from a culture that doesn't see it as normal to seek out formal services, this is something they could easily forget. So you need to repeatedly assure them of your confidentiality. The reason I've been talking about these barriers is so that you have a really good appreciation of the hell they've been through before they arrive. If a service provider does not understand that a long emotional and mental journey has already been travelled up to this point, then you might miss the fact that you play an extremely critical role in perhaps a tiny window where this person has the chance to move from a victim identity to a survivor identity because of your help with helping them find a sense of empowerment, resilience, healing, well-being. By analogy, we know that male victims of child sexual abuse do not often seek out formal services. So when they do, you know it's a big deal. It's the same principle here. It shouldn't be the case of you going, oh, hello, how are you? How can I help you today? It needs to be, hello, how are you? How can I help you today? You really have to know and understand the gravity of the story that has come before. But organisations are in their own neoliberal hell. They do crisis-driven work on a shoestring budget. So we have to make sure our expectations are realistic because that's humane. And this is where service delivery models help. They act as a bit of a checklist. What should I be looking at? My head is full and bursting with complex cases and clients. Please help me identify at least the key things that I shouldn't be missing. So in that vein, I've designed a service delivery model to try and make it a bit easier for people who work in this space. The first thing I want to mention is that you've got an individual sitting at the centre of intervention. And then there are 4 arms or tiers that impact on their experience of that service setting. It's built in line with Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, which says that if you're going to design any service delivery model, then it should be meaningful by being grounded to a particular context. If a model is too generic, then it kind of loses meaning. So this model is grounded to the Australian context. The other key element is that even though we're talking about a person from a CALD community, they are still a person. This is an individual sitting in front of you. So yes, ethnicity matters, but you only want to use stereotypical knowledge in a way that guides your interaction with them and not dictate it. So the factors within these 4 tiers that we're about to look at need to be implemented in a flexible way that is tailored to that particular person. That way you're not boxing them in by their ethnicity. You're going, yes, I know it matters, but I also know that it's not the only thing that matters. Okay. So now let's look at those 4 tiers. The first is the trauma itself. So these are factors relating to the abuse incident or incidents, such as their gender, age, how old were they when the abuse first started, how long has it been going on for, what is the severity of the abuse, is it single or multi-perpetrator, what is the extent of physical violence or degree of intrusiveness, frequency, do they know who the perpetrator is this a case of incest, a neighbour, a stranger, where did the abuse happen, is it at home, at school, out-of-home care, religious institution, etc. All of these things have an impact on understanding that particular client's needs. The next tier is everything to do with CALD. So you would need to check their English proficiency and whether there was a need for an interpreter. What's their generational status? Are they first or second generation? Is there presence of intergenerational conflict? And how is that impacting on family dynamics? How long have they lived in Australia? And so what is their extent of acculturation, which can then impact their attitudes about collectivism and patriarchy? How have they changed? How does that person view family reputation or community standing? How important are these things to them? What are their attitudes about help seeking from within the family as well as outside? What are their attitudes about traditional gender roles? How connected are they to their extended family? This one's really important. In collectivist cultures, it's generally not the government's role to provide child safety, it's the community's. So it's completely normal for every person in the street to be watching out for all the other children in the street. And if someone's doing something wrong, they'll yell out, hey, stop, even if it's not your child, okay? So when they migrate to Western contexts, a lot of family and cultural capital is lost. And they might be feeling quite socially isolated. They've lost what was normal community support in raising a child and providing safety. Or it could be that they've got really good connection and access to community support, which is, I see it as an immunity shot. It's the strongest protective factor within collectivist cultures. So they have access to it, but there's been a major falling out. So it's there, but they can't access that protection. You have to tease out all of these things. What's their religion and orthodoxy? For example, I might be Muslim, but not practicing. So that has an impact on my story. What's their citizenship or visa status? Do they have a fear of deportation? Is there a history of forced migration? Again, all impacting that person's particular story. What's their awareness and understanding of systems and services? Because even for people who've lived in the country for a long time or who were born in the country, it can be confusing. So for a newly arrived migrant, it can be completely overwhelming. What's their cultural identity, sense of belonging? Are they visibly different through their skin colour or religious attire, for example, which then invites negative stereotyping, racism, discrimination, social exclusion, vilification? How are the media talking about different people? All of these things have a huge impact on how that person experiences their life. There are also factors that have nothing to do with being a member of a CAL group, and it's important that you pay attention to these things too. Where do they live? Are we talking about an urban or regional or remote area? Do they live in a low socioeconomic area? What's their family structure like? Are they living in a single parent household? How many siblings are there? Are there any disabilities that you should be aware of? That one's really important because the research shows that children with a disability are at the highest risk of child sexual abuse, in which case you need to be taking an intersectional approach to culture and disability. What is their sexuality? Do they identify as part of the LGBTI community? These factors will add texture and depth to that person's story, but like all things, they will lead with what they want to share. What are the impacts of the abuse on their physical health, their mental health? This is a point I'm going to come back to. Are they reporting social difficulties, problems studying, keeping employment? Is there threat of homelessness, substance abuse? How long did it take for them to disclose the abuse? And do they have any examples of receiving a supportive response from the people around them? Because all of this has an impact on their attachment style to caregivers post-disclosure. Finally, there's the service element, and there are two levels within this component: personal and organisational. The personal level refers to interactions between the client and frontline service provider, and the organisational level refers to the backing behind that frontline worker. It's very easy to think that the frontline caseworker bears the greatest responsibility for delivering a culturally competent service. And that's understandable because that's who the client interacts with. That's the face of the organisation, from which they then make inferences about the service organisation. But I would actually argue that the two levels are equally important. And that's because a service provider is only ever really going to be as good as they can if they have an effective organisational structure supporting their work. So let's first look at the personal level. Obviously, a key element is not being racist. So not having racist attitudes, being empathic, high on patience, high on open-mindedness. All of these things translate to a good service response. It's also important that service providers are practiced in reflecting on themselves, their own culture, so they can see what is shared and what is not. And this includes constructive engagement with white privilege, so that you don't make the mistake of thinking that if you're culturally aware, that's the same as being racially aware. They're obviously related, but they are two different things. Cultural competency at the personal level also involves having a sense of efficacy when working with CALD clients. So that's about having some knowledge, sensitivity, confidence. If someone were to ask you, do you think you could work well with this client group? You would say, yeah, I think so. Okay, that's having a sense of efficacy. Part of developing that sense of efficacy is being aware of non-ethnic factors. Usually when we think about CALD communities, it's all about cultural knowledge, okay? But it's also about non-cultural knowledge, things that have nothing to do with culture or that might be shared across cultural groups. So managing cultural and non-cultural knowledge is important for engaging well with this client group. Another component of cultural competency at the personal level is being aware of the pros and cons of a medical versus sociological approach to the treatment of mental illness as a result of child sexual abuse. Now, this is heavy content, as this slide clearly indicates, so I'm going to work through it slowly and piece together the logic. Labels of mental illness threaten the family name. So if it comes to light that somebody has a mental illness, This shames the family name, which reduces their standing in the community. In a hierarchical context, that needs to be protected at all cost. As a result, victims of child sexual abuse who are now suffering a mental illness may be afraid to engage with talk therapists like social workers, counsellors, psychologists, psychiatrists, and instead go to a GP and say, I'm not sleeping very well. Can you please give me a prescription for sleeping tablets or something like that? What they're doing is accessing medical as opposed to non-medical help and somatizing the symptoms of their mental illness because it's safer than talking outright and saying, I'm unwell. The minute they say that, they're bringing their family name into disrepute. That's a threat they'd rather not face, so it becomes safer, culturally acceptable, to somatize or physicalize the symptoms of mental illness and present to a medical practitioner like a GP. Now, some labels of mental illness are really good in terms of locating what the problem is. For example, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is an excellent label for saying this person has experienced a trauma. The problem is not because they're crazy or mad or couldn't cope. It's because they've endured a trauma. The problem is out there. It's not in here. So if you get that diagnosis, it's not so stigmatizing as others can be, but it still leaves that person feeling responsible for their mental illness. Okay, we've all acknowledged that I've experienced a trauma, but I'm still unwell. And now the burden of responsibility to address that belongs to me. With all these cultural dynamics in play, it could be argued that accessing some help is better than accessing no help. So I would not write off a medical approach. It may be just enough to get this person through that week or month. What I would say is that if it was the only thing being depended on, that is problematic. I wouldn't say that one approach is better than the other, but rather that awareness of both, what they offer, their pros, their cons, the limitations associated with each, that's what's important to be aware of. The greatest benefit of a sociological approach to the treatment of mental illness is that it squarely names the issue, that child sexual abuse is a gendered crime. And that is true for all cultural groups. The vast majority of perpetrators are male. Any silence that surrounds child sexual abuse therefore protects patriarchy. The silence that's working to protect the family name is what is keeping patriarchy in place. Within collectivism, where the culture explicitly values traditional gender roles and family reputation, this patriarchy is intensified. It's what's causing them to seek out a GP rather than a social worker or counsellor or psychologist. But this is where the role of a GP could actually be really important. They might go to them first, but the GP then acts as a conduit to say, you know, if there's an issue, maybe you could share that with someone who specialises in listening to that. The greatest thing about talk therapists is that they share the load. They listen to your story. They hear your trauma. They provide tools of empowerment. Try this, maybe try that. When you're having a bad day, give this a go, okay? They are extremely important professionals. Through that talking, they also have the opportunity to tell that victim, this isn't your fault, and what you have experienced is part of a much larger patriarchal problem. In broader society, people may be scared to name that, but in the clinical space, you don't have to repeat that silence. It can be extremely rage-inducing when you first learn feminist language, but it can also be incredibly liberating to understand it wasn't your fault and you are not alone. They are challenging conversations, but important ones, and it requires knowing what both approaches can offer, where something might be a good fit for a particular client and where they might be gently nudged out of their comfort zone to potentially experiencing great liberation, great understanding about what has happened. Okay, another element of cultural competency at the personal level is acknowledging that formal services cannot always allow someone to recover from their mental illness. People may think, oh, just go and get therapy and you'll be fine. But that's making the error of professional omnipotence, that professionals are the fix-all. That's all they need. That's not always the case. Sometimes we're talking about people with severe distress who are diagnostically meeting severe symptoms of mental illness, for example, borderline personality disorder. They've genuinely given things a go, such as dialectic behavioural therapy, but it just hasn't worked. I think it's important that professionals do not give false hope as if everything can be recovered from. But you can provide a hope-inspiring approach by saying, you may not fully recover, but you can still manage this. For example, if you have chronic asthma, it's not your fault that you have it, but you do have it forever. So you'll simply say, okay, I have chronic asthma. Give me my Ventolin. That's what this approach is about. It's not about killing hope. It's about not providing false hope, because that is a disservice to the client. It is conveying to them that you are an extremely important tool within a catalogue of tools, but not the only one. And you need to encourage other options that they can also tap into. If you don't do that, then I would say that that was an irresponsible use of professional power. The main one is encouraging self-help, reading relevant books, accessing online resources, engaging in music, art, or narrative therapy, writing a memoir, getting a dog, joining a choir, gardening. These are all really empowering tools for the self-management of well-being, which gives them their power back. Under some conditions, not all, it may also be useful to suggest family therapy with non-offending members. This is because we have the primary victim, the child, but their victimization intensely impacts the people around them who care for that child. That process is known as secondary victimization. And if you don't acknowledge that you are also a victim that needs help, then it could interfere with your ability to support and protect the primary victim. It's also an opportunity for non-offending parents and guardians to gain knowledge and tools about how to protect their child from further re-victimization. It might also be good to encourage group therapy in addition to the one-on-one formal service, where they can gain support from other victim survivors of child sexual abuse. But you have to play these two options, family therapy and group therapy, by ear. I wouldn't say that there's a general rule about them being good. because they can also increase risk of psychological harm. But at least letting people know they're an option is a good thing. Finally, cultural competency at the organisational level. One characteristic is about promotional materials and whether they're visually inclusive. So like literally in a microsecond, people from CALD communities know whether they're welcome at your service by the branding. Who's in the picture on the website and the pamphlets. So if you want to say to your local community, we're here for everyone, then your visual branding should reflect that. And where cost is not prohibitive, it would also be great to translate your written documents. It's also important to provide interpreters or bilingual staff if required, because the concepts that professionals talk about are complex. So for someone who might think their English is good enough, it might actually be going straight past their head. Ideally, they're also trained in matters to do with sexual assault, because if they walk in blind, that could open up a whole heap of problems that would have been mitigated if you were drawing from a pool of trained interpreters who know how to work in this complex and sensitive space. And if that's a problem, then provide such training. Another aspect is about having an ethnically diverse workforce, including in management positions. Take a good look around and see how many people of colour are in decision-making roles in your organisation. In Australia, CALD communities comprise about a third of the population, but we do not represent a third of management boards. And that's because of racism. So the organisation needs to ask itself, are we really living and breathing racial equality? Are we really implementing our value for diversity? Do we genuinely prioritise it? Because talk is cheap. The other reason you need an ethnically diverse workforce is so that you can provide choice to your clients. Within CALD communities, there is high fear that an ethnically matched caseworker might breach their legal requirement for confidentiality and tell everyone in the community. So they would actually prefer someone who's not the same as them. Don't give me an Indian caseworker, give me a white caseworker, give me a Chinese caseworker. I don't care who you give me, just don't give me someone from the same cultural background as me. This means that you need to have a pool ready and waiting to address the needs of any client that presents at your door. You can't be taking the position that CALD families can be dealt with by CALD workers. Yes, they might have tacit cultural knowledge, but that doesn't mean the client wants them. Another characteristic is about providing regular training, and there are two main reasons for this. One is that we live in a global world. People are moving, so we're always encountering new and emerging communities. 30 years ago in Australia, we didn't have many people migrating from Africa, but that's a different landscape now. And just because I'm brown, it doesn't mean I understand the Sudanese experience. We all need to learn about everyone. We all need knowledge. We all need training. So it can't be a case of, oh yeah, we did that once. I remember having a cultural competency training session. It needs to be seen as something that is ongoing learning. The other reason you need this refresher approach is because of staff turnover. I think it's a bit of a running joke in child protection that if you made it past like 3 years, you're like a veteran. So the burnout associated with this work is phenomenal, and therefore so is the staff turnover. As a result, you need to be constantly providing this kind of training. It's also important that service organisations write, develop, implement a multicultural framework so they have written documents like mission statements or practice frameworks that actually have the word CALD in it. Writing it down provide some level of formal accountability for that organisation. But it can't just be rhetoric, as if a strategic plan is enough to say, look, we're committed to racial equality. It comes off as lip service. It can't just be in principle, it has to be in practice too. This one I can't stress enough. I see the collection of data on ethnicity-related variables to be mandatory. Where were they born? What languages do they speak? Do they need an interpreter? What's their citizenship status? Their refugee pathways of entries, their faith, their self-identified cultural background. All of this stuff is really important. To me, it's like not collecting information on gender. If you did that, it's basically saying that you don't think that bit of information has any value. What's the point of collecting it? It's not going to tell me anything I need to know. Obviously, that's not true. The more you know about your client base, the better able you are to meet their needs. My final point is about developing and nurturing relationships with local CALD organisations and their members. This way, you start to develop a trusting relationship with the people around you, but most importantly, you can borrow their intel when you need it. It's really important that practitioners who work in these complex spaces don't feel like they need to know everything. You don't. You just need to know where to ask. If you've got some bare bones basics and the right mindset in terms of wanting to use cultural knowledge and racial power responsibly, that's all you really need. And then from there, you just talk to the right person to get the right information that you need. And that is it. I feel like I made very good time.
You did, Pooja. That's fantastic. We have 10 minutes left for questions. If people have questions, can you put them through into the chat box? Or if you want to ask them yourself, put your name into the chat box. I am going to ask you, Pooja, if you can, to move back to slide 8 for 2 seconds. If you can.
You're expecting a level of intelligence here that's not going to come.
Oh, there we go. That's the way it's...
This one?
No, keep going to a few more, but there we go. And the only reason I'm talking about slide 8, thank you, is one of the main things that we talk about in safeguarding, and particularly with the National Catholic Safeguarding Standards, is person-centered. And I looked at that and I thought, that's exactly what that model is. It's all about being a person-centered approach to you're talking about service provision, but it's a person-centered approach to safeguarding. It's a person-centered approach to dealing with anyone within our community. So thank you so much. I sort of looked at that slide. I thought, I love that.
Excellent. It's resonated.
It's resonated. That's my personal comment. Apologies for anyone else who had something else they wanted to say, but that was exactly there. Sheridan has asked, what would you suggest we use instead of the term cowled?
I need about 4 hours for that. It's, God, how do I say this quickly? There are many terms. The one it took over was NESB, non-English speaking background, and I kind of like that the best because it's just a clear non-English speaking background. Like I'm telling you what it is, the marker. It's very clear language. The problem is it doesn't include race. It doesn't include language. It's reducing the experience of this group to language. That's the problem with that. I have a whole module on this term, which is why I'm not going to derail here. After a while, everyone started kicking up a big stink about CALD, rightly so. Then we moved to ethnic minority. No one likes the word minority. No one likes the word ethnic. It harks back to a time of WOGs, Greeks and Italians. We don't like the word ethnic. And who am I to be minor? I'm not minor. I'm part of the global majority. Person of color. has some credence in some spaces. I think that's a whole, yeah. And I think there's one group that came out with CALM, which is culturally and racially marginalized. And I like that again because it's squarely naming the issue. And I think unless your language is saying what you want to say, you're going to get bogged down by PC. No one likes PC. Everyone's over that. But we understand there's a problem, but your language has to be clear so that we go, okay, there's a problem, and now how are we going to rectify it from there? So your words are telling you your problem. So make sure your words are clear.
Thank you, Pooja. I'm sort of still waiting for other people to put in questions, so I'm going to ask another one that I had,
Sure,
if you
sure.
don't mind. You talk
Go.
about training for cultural competency. What sort of suggestions would you include within that training?
So I would Google training because I can't tell you how many people and organizations provide this. And then it would be what is included would be up to them. But at a basic level, we're talking about people coming to terms with the fact that power is differentially related by skin color. And it requires an extraordinary amount of working through defensiveness to get to the other side of going, I actually just want to be part of humans. I'm anyone who says, oh, I don't see color, I'm like, I've immediately written you off because that's like saying, I don't see gender. And I'm like, again, you are not speaking clearly. And I want you to see my color. I want you to honor me. I just want you to understand that I want to see us as equals. And I hope you are approaching me in the same way. And
Thank
we live in a world where we inherit places in the ecosystem that don't make us equals. So each of us have to do the work to say, I don't want to be stereotyped and I don't want to stereotype you. Whatever I'm asking of you is what I want in return. I will be responsible with my power. You will be responsible with yours. And that would be the crux of any cultural competency training. But then again, applied to that particular organization after that.
And I appreciate that because I know a lot of different organizations that offer that cultural competency training. It was more trying to get an understanding of what you wanted the goal of that training to be.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so your answer really helped me with
yeah.
that. So thank you.
Not all organizations are ready. They get very scared, they get very nervous. And the emotional labor for the trainers is profound. So people are burnt out on all angles, but you still have to do the work. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Harry has put in a message asking, could you please help me how to become part of people instead of being separated?
I think oh God, I feel like I need to move from coffee to whiskey. Uh, we we live in a world where I think I've reached a point now. I'll be 50 next year, just so you understand how many years are under the belt here. Um, I've reached a point where I just want to talk to someone, and if they're just lovely, they're my tribe. It's almost that simple. It's almost that simple. And then it's not. So many people are carrying so many unhealed wounds. You can't blame them to a certain degree. It's tough. I think if each little local network is doing its best to look after one another, I'm hoping in a long generation from now, we've got a very strong country where everyone gets that we're just all the same.
Thank you so much, Pooja. We're not getting any additional questions in the chat box. We're getting a number of thank yous and gratitude for the clear presentation and the time and the important messages. And so I will conclude the session if you don't mind, but I am going to add my thanks. Um, I always find that when you're presenting information, you're presenting it in a very clear, concise, pathwayed perspective, as in there's always, I can see the steps for where we're going and where we're ending up. And so I really appreciate that. That while we were talking today about service provision rather than safeguarding, it's still very relevant to our community.
Yeah.
And that there's a lot of the same sorts of themes and tools and ideas that we can take away. So once again,
Yeah.
thank you so much for helping us
Thank
and
you.
providing
Thank
this
you.
information.
Thank you
For
for having
everyone
me.
else in the audience, I will be sending out an email with a link to where you can get your certificate, and then there'll be another email probably Friday, maybe later, maybe early next week, with a link to the recording. So it's sort of two email follows ups. But Pooja, I'll also include you in the email for the link for the
Excellent.
recording. But thank you
Excellent.
so much, everyone, for joining us. And what this is our last webinar before Easter, so I hope everyone has a wonderful and happy Holy Week, and that it's not too hectic for them. But thank you again, Pooja. I appreciate it.